Okay, welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read High-Risers by Ben Austen. We are on page 68, chapter 4, entitled Warriors. Dolores Wilson, quote, "It was real nice and quiet and peaceful in Cabrini," end quote, Dolores Wilson would say about the years before the King riots. Quote, "We didn't have to worry about gangbanging. After Daley put the stones in Cabrini, that's when we started to see gang writings on the walls. That's when shots started ringing out. That's how gangs with the plural began to form at Cabrini Green," end quote. The Stones were the Cobra Stones, a West Side gang. Fires in the West Side neighborhoods after King's assassination left more than 1,000 people homeless. The city happened to be by far the largest property owner in Chicago, and it had vacancies. In a simple act of deploying resources at a time of crisis, the city relocated West Side families into 1,150 through 1,160 North Sedgwick, connected towers at Cabrini Green just to the north of Dolores Wilson's high-rise. That's what the social safety net was supposed to do. It caught people who were falling, saving them before they crashed into the depths. But it was one thing to operate a housing program and another to run an emergency shelter. At the very least, a sudden influx of homeless families required a boost in managers and services meant to assist them, yet none of those things accompanied them to Cabrini Green. The Cobra Stones were soon operating out of 1,150 through 1,160 North Sedgwick, and the building came to be known as, quote, the Rock, end quote. The black gangs in Chicago were split into two alliances, the People and the Folks. The People included Black Stone Rangers, the Cobra Stones, and Mickey Cobras, and the Vice Lords. The Folks were the Gangster Disciples and the Black Disciples, both started on the South Side. Because of Cabrini Green's isolation from other black neighborhoods, the street gangs there were mostly unaffiliated with either of these alliances. But the presence of the Cobra Stones helped change that. Rifles were fired from the windows of the Cobra Stones' high-rise, and teenagers from the towers around it armed themselves as well. If Stones were shooting at them, they were going to shoot back. In one of the neighboring buildings, guys formed a gang called the Blacks, and the blacktop between the close-cropped towers along the Old Deaf Corner was called the killing field for all the violence it saw. Standing in this open field, looking up at the walls of cross-hatched red high-rises on all sides as if from the bottom of a ravine, you realized suddenly how vulnerable you were. What before were just buildings staring indifferently at one another now could seem vicious. 1,000 windows rising up, and in any one of them, a heedless 17-year-old with a rifle could smudge you out as he would an ant. A woman pushing a baby in a stroller was almost shot as she passed below. Hubert Wilson's Corsair stopped practicing on the blacktop. The priest running the nearby St. Joseph Parish opened up his gymnasium for them, but on their way home at night, when tensions between the buildings were high, the boys and girls sprinted across the exposed concrete tract. Dolores never had any trouble with her daughters, and Chi-Chi was a bookworm. He'd sit out nights on the ramp under the overhead light and read past midnight. Her other sons were more rebellious, Michael in particular, who received the greatest share of Hubert's whippings. Michael was among the teens in their high-rise who formed a gang called the Deuces. Dolores wasn't happy about it. But she understood. Quote, "If they came out the building on one side, there are the Stones shooting at them," end quote, she explained. Quote, "They came out the other, and there are the Blacks," end quote. One night, the police grabbed Michael from in front of his building. They took him on the expressway, driving 6 miles south to Bridgeport, the Irish enclave where Mayor Daley and many city cops lived. Michael believed that the police were arming the Cobra Stones at Cabrini Green. He said he'd seen a patrol car pull up in front of 1,150 through 1,160 North Sedgwick, the cops popping their trunk and handing out rifles to the gang members. Now the police dropped him off in Bridgeport. Quote, "They didn't even have black cars in Bridgeport," end quote, Dolores would say. She and Hubert were sleeping when the telephone rang. Michael was calling from a phone booth outside a tavern. Hubert told him not to move and to try to not be seen, and he got his son and brought him home. Another time, Michael was taken to the police station. When Dolores arrived, a sergeant was asking her son to identify the police officers who had tossed him against the wall. Dolores could see the cops waiting eagerly for Michael's response. The police both ignored and brutalized the all-black population in Cabrini, and she felt sure they were looking for a reason to take him into a back room and teach him what happens to boys from the projects who challenge the authority of the cops. Quote, "Shut up, Michael," end quote, she shouted. Quote, "Didn't I tell you about lying?" End quote. Stunned at first, he caught on. Michael said he didn't know who messed him up, and he left with his mother. With the increase in violence at Cabrini, Hubert bought Dolores a gun. It was a cute little Derringer with a pearl handle that she kept in her purse. She was more afraid of the gun going off when she reached for her car fare than any situation in which she might feel the need to use it. Dolores had stayed loyal to her Southside hairdresser all these years, and every few weeks she traveled back to her old neighborhood by bus and train. On a return trip from the Southside, she was on the Division Street bus when three guys got on at Clark, several blocks shy of Cabrini Green. They surrounded a Mexican man seated 2 rows in front of her and stuck a nail file to his throat. Dolores started tapping the young man on the back. Quote, "Why don't you leave that man alone? This isn't right," she cried, end quote. I messed up the quotations right there. No way was she going to pull out the gun. Quote, "I wasn't that much of a good Samaritan," end quote, she say. Quote, "A tap on the back was about all I had in me," quote, end quote. When the bus driver passed 2 police officers, he tooted his horn, and the muggers jumped off the bus and ran into the nearest Cabrini high-rise. The Mexican man reported the crime to the officers, and Dolores, being nosy, got off the bus to listen. But then she felt a sprinkle of rain. With her hair freshly done, she jogged home across the blacktop, a hand covering her head. The elevator doors of her building opened, and she saw a crisp $10 bill on the floor, folded in half. She told Hubert about the entire incident, saying, quote, "See, God knows a good deed," end quote. Okay, so I think some of the first thoughts that comes to my mind from reading that first passage is a reminder of the specific experiences that Black people and people of color and communities of color have when it comes with the institution of policing and with police officers, and how it is something that is generationally traumatizing. And so you see here, not only was Michael traumatized from his interactions with police officers in Chicago, but his mother was also traumatized from her interactions with police officers in Chicago, to the point where she knew that she didn't want her son to be truthful and be honest about what these police officers had done to him, in case they continue to do more and even worse things to him. And so you have to then ask yourself, or think to yourself, consider to yourself, when Michael has a child, what do you think he will teach his child about police officers? And what do you think he will explain to his children about police officers? And what will his children endure when it comes to police officers? And then when Michael's a grandfather, what the things that he will teach his grandchildren about police officers? And so you see how the institution of policing, through corruption, through terroristic actions, has become delegitimized in the communities that, based on the things that happen, some would say need police the most, or that police needs to be the most legitimate at. And because the policing has been so delegitimized in those places based off of the actions of police officers, it leads you to understand how there is such high violence in these areas, such high crime in these areas, because not only are people in situations where they are in poverty, where they are in situations where they have substandard living, there are situations where they have inadequate education, they don't have equitable employment opportunities. They also view the police and see the police as being complicit in crime, as being participants in violence. And that gets you to understand how in the south side of Chicago now, or in the west side of Chicago now, or in the south side or the west side of Rockford, or how because like I said, these issues that we're reading about may be specific to Chicago, but they are not unique to Chicago. These things have happened in Rockford. This is how public housing developed in Rockford. Public housing developed in New York and California. And of course, all of these different places have their own specific stories, but the overall the overall cycle of substandard living, of miseducation, of discrimination, of police terrorism is a cycle that is perpetuated and is repeated in so many different areas in the country. And so when people ask, why don't you, what about what's going on in Chicago? Or what about black on black crime? What about intercommunity violence? That is the low hanging fruit. And all it takes is a little bit of effort. We're only 100 episodes in, barely, to the Rockford Reading Daily podcast. And you can already see how and why the type of issues that exist in these communities exist. And we're reading 30 to 45 minutes a day, and it's been illustrated perfectly. And then I think another thing that is important to point out is how Michael spoke about how the police officers were arming the gangs that were inside Chicago. And that's something that has been known about police since the inception of police, is that police officers have been participants in violence in communities of color, that police officers have allowed for drugs to be sold, allowed for drugs to be pushed into communities and into areas, allowed for violence to be pushed into communities, into areas, that police officers have, because of corruption, sold guns to gangs in these areas, sold drugs to gangs in these areas, taken money from gangs in these areas to do bidding for them or to look the other way. And so when people make it seem as if more police officers or more money to the institution of policing is what's going to solve these issues, those are people who are uneducated and uninformed about just the nature of the institution of policing in these specific areas, in these communities. And here, let's continue reading. In 1969, David Barksdale, the founder of the Black Disciples, merged his gang with the Gangster Disciples, creating the Black Gangster Disciples Nation. The union put an end to street fights between their groups and allowed them better to compete with Jeff Fort's Black Stone Rangers for control of the Southside drug and gambling trade. While gun battles between the Rangers and the Black Gangster Disciples continued, the gangs also drew attention for announcing their shift into legal activities. The, quote, street organizations, end quote, said they were now going to be forces for good, using their administrative know-how and manpower to rebuild. The Woodlawn Organization, a grassroots community that formed on the South Side to fight urban renewal plans in nearby Hyde Park, received almost $1 million in federal grants from President Johnson's Office of Economic Opportunity to operate job training programs led by the Disciples and the Rangers. The two gangs ran their own training facilities targeting delinquent teens. Fort's Rangers started a newspaper, a legal defense project, and the Black Peace Stone Youth Center. In North Lawndale, on the west side, a gang called the Conservative Vice Lords went even further. They launched the Street Academy for high school dropouts, an art studio, and a neighborhood beautification effort, quote, grass where there was glass, end quote, as well as employment and housing services. The group opened the Teen Town Ice Cream Parlor, 2 recreation centers, and the African Lion clothing store. The gang legally incorporated, becoming CVL Inc., and received funding from the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations, from state and federal government, from Sears, Western Electric, and Illinois Bell Telephone, and from Sammy Davis Jr. members held open houses for the police and met with city officials to prove the authenticity of their about face. Quote, the turnaround came because we were going to start doing things in our community for ourselves, end quote, the CVL spokesperson Bobby Gore said. For a time in 1969, the 3 major black gangs formed an alliance they called LSD, for Lords, Stones, Disciples, and in a series of demonstrations targeted the city's trade unions for failing to hire, train, and promote African Americans. They shut down construction sites and marched on City Hall, the sight of these young black men in berets and sunglasses masked in the loop, a source of pride or terror, depending on your perspective. The model for going straight wasn't another black gang, but Old Man Daly. In the summer of 1919, when Daly was 17 and president of his Hamburg Athletic Club, Chicago experienced its worst race riot. The violence was triggered when a black teenager at a Lake Michigan beach drifted across the invisible barrier dividing segregated waters. Whites responded by pelting him with rocks until he drowned. The larger cause of the rioting was the surge of African Americans then arriving in the city from the South, the first wave of the Great Migration. In neighborhoods like Daly's Bridgeport, on the border of the Black Belt, white residents were ready to push back against the tide. Already that year, there have been numerous cases of African Americans moving into these borderlands only to have their homes dynamited. Over the riot's 5 days, 38 people were killed and hundreds more seriously injured, African Americans making up 2/3 of the casualties. An investigation into the riots found that the Hamburg Youth Organization was guilty of instigating attacks on blacks, though Daly was never personally linked to any of the assaults. He was able to age out of the group and move on because teens in Bridgeport had jobs awaiting them. If there were comparable opportunities in Chicago's black neighborhoods, CVL leaders argued, then vice lords, disciples, and Cobra Stones likely could also graduate to legitimate careers. Some of the community work that gangs did was genuine, a great deal of it not. The same could be said of work undertaken by city agencies. But Mayor Daley dismissed it all, declaring any claims by gangs of legitimacy pure subterfuge, their efforts fronts for illicit operations. In a democratic Chicago without an opposing party, Daley had hardened into a law and order conservative. He'd handled Martin Luther King Jr. as a subversive, declared war on rioters after his assassination, and met demonstrations in the city during the 1968 Democratic National Convention with brute force. Daley now announced a new policy that would treat street gangs not as wayward youth, but as organized crime. The Chicago police established a special gang intelligence unit, and Daley pressured foundations to cut off funding to the groups, veto job training grants, and prohibited police from holding discussions with any suspected gang members. The gang unit raided the programs that the Disciples and Rangers operated with the Woodlawn organization, and on an early morning in December 1969, 14 Chicago police officers stormed a West Side apartment where members of the Black Panthers Party were living. The officers killed both Fred Hampton, the 21-year-old leader of the Illinois chapter of the Panthers, and Mark Clark, on security detail for the group, claiming self-defense amid a fierce gun battle. Ballistic reports revealed that out of the nearly 100 shots fired, all but one had come from the guns of the police, and Hampton and others were still in their beds. That same month, Chicago police arrested several gang leaders on a range of charges, some of which were soon dismissed and others of which stuck. Bobby Gore, the CVL spokesperson, was charged with the murder that occurred outside an Ogden Avenue bar and was sentenced to 25 to 40 years. In prison, he called, quote, Kissinger, end quote, for his efforts to keep the peace between inmates. He was called, quote, Kissinger, end quote, for his efforts to keep the peace between inmates. And when he was released in 1979, he went to work at the Cabrini Green offices of a foundation that helped other former inmates find jobs. Within the Chicago Police Department, a force of 12,000 officers, efforts were also made to repair relationships with the city's black communities. In the fall of 1968, after police officers chased stone-throwing teens into a Cabrini high-rise and maced a 1-year-old in his aunt's arms, the department sent 45 black officers into the housing development to calm residents and avert another riot. The police started a special walk-and-talk beat at the Cabrini Green as well, officers on foot socializing with people, with the hope that cops and Cabrini residents could get to know and even respect one another. Sergeant James Severin and Officer Anthony Rosado volunteered for the community policing assignment. Severin, 38, was a former insurance investigator and Army corporal. A 13-year veteran of the police force, he had worked the security detail protecting King when the civil rights leader moved to the West Side. Rosado was 35, married, with 2 children. He and his brother had signed up together to become police officers 4 years earlier. Both Rosado and Severin were even-tempered and unassuming, and amenable to the idea that it might be more prudent to throw a baseball with the child in public housing than to arrest him for throwing bottles at cars. It was still light out on July 17, 1970, at 7 o'clock p.m., when Rosado and Severin were on their foot patrol. They walked into the baseball diamond in Seward Park, below the surrounding red high-rises. Rifle shots came simultaneously from 2 of the towers overhead, 1150 North Cedric and 1117 North Cleveland, The Rock, and Dolores Wilson's building. Severin and Rosado were both hit. The officers arriving on the scene couldn't get to them. Snipers continued to fire down from the high-rises, and they were forced to take cover. More police arrived, 100 of them, blasting out windows and screens as they traded shots with the unseen enemy. Military veterans on the force said it was the closest thing they experienced in Chicago to their tours overseas. Officers brought in heavy weapons, artillery, while a police helicopter hovered over the park, shining its spotlight. Patrolmen drove their squad cars onto the infield and used them as shields as they retrieved their colleagues. Severin and Rosado were taken to a nearby hospital where they were pronounced dead on arrival. Kelvin Cannon was 6 and saw the helicopter whirling outside his window. The police stormed all the buildings and blocked exits. One of Dolores Wilson's neighbors asked the police what was going on, and the cops knocked him down and beat him with batons. The police searched apartments using battering rams and sledgehammers to break down any doors not open to them. Officers arrested several residents that night, including anyone who didn't cooperate. Among them was 23-year-old George Knights, a janitor's helper in the high-rises. When a warrant was issued for another suspect, Johnny Veal, a 17-year-old Cobra Stone, Veal feared that officers would kill him if he was brought in for interrogation, so with his lawyer, he later turned himself into a judge. Prosecutors said that Knights and Veal were rival gang members teaming up to kill cops. They were each found guilty and sentenced to terms of 100 to 199 years in prison. As difficult as it was to shock the city after the turmoil of recent years, the cop killings represented for many Chicago's collapse into chaos. On the streets, any regard for authority was lost. Quote, a complete breakdown of law and order in this town when the citizens murdered 2 policemen whose assignment was to improve relations between the police department and the citizens, end quote, said a representative of the police. An editorial in The Defender called the murders, quote, one of the most revolting of the current epidemic of terrorist attacks in the black community, end quote. Public housing had been viewed with distrust from its outset. The critiques usually colored by a general weariness of any assistance for the poor. In the Cold War hysteria of the 1950s, residents in the Cabrini row houses were forced to take loyalty oaths in exchange for their government aid. But now public housing was also seen as the place where too many welfare-dependent black people were stacked atop one another in too little space. The government housing intended to clear out the slums a mere generation ago was now the, quote, projects, end quote, and epitomized all the unruliness and otherness of the city in decline. And Cabrini Green at this moment became the proxy for all troubled public housing. Quote, that's when it started, end quote, Dolores Wilson said. Quote, now they could say it happened at Cabrini, end quote. And I think that what's important to point out in that passage is that the conditions that the city of Chicago and that the country of America allowed to permeate in Cabrini Green is what led to these officers being shot and killed. The same way that multiple people were being killed inside of Cabrini by other Cabrini residents or from other gang violence. And this is something that I think is very important to point out about our society, is that you cannot just isolate violence. You cannot just say, well, violence is happening on the other side of town, so as long as it's happening over there, I'm not going to worry about it. Whatever happens over there doesn't have anything to do with me. Just keep them isolated, keep the violence happening over there. You can't just say, well, when violence happens, you can't just look at an individual involved in an incident of violence and say, let's just get rid of this individual without taking the time to look at the overall issues in a society that is leading to this individual committing violence. Because what happens is, first, the violence will eventually bleed out from this area that it's isolated in, and it will eventually touch somebody who is not in the area that you're trying to keep it isolated in. And then secondly, you can lock up an individual, but as long as poverty continues to exist, discrimination continues to exist, substandard housing and living conditions continue to exist, inadequate employment continues to exist, the the individual that you remove will just be replaced by another individual who may be even further down the line of trauma because they've seen what's happened to somebody else. And so because they ignored these issues that were happening in Cabrini Green, and because they allowed for these police officers to lose the legitimacy that the institution of policing has, because they were violating people's rights, because they were treating the people that were living inside of Cabrini Green as enemies, instead of treating them as civilians, instead of treating them as neighbors, as human beings. You cannot be surprised when those people return that type of action. And this is not me, and this is not trying to justify the things that those people are doing, because I don't believe in murder in any type of a sense. I believe that there's always something that is there. When you are trying to be just or believe in justice, when you're trying to eradicate a social issue, I don't believe murder or violence can do that. I do believe that violence begets violence and murder begets murder, but that doesn't just work on one side. The police officers who were enacting violence upon these citizens, their violence is going to be returned back onto them at some point. And that's true even now when you see a news story about a police officer being shot or a police officer being killed. There's 20 stories about police officers killing people that you don't hear about. And those things work hand in hand with each other. If you treat somebody like an enemy, you cannot be surprised when they begin to treat you like an enemy as well. And so the true thing that has to be addressed is the institution of policing, the institution of public housing, the institution of education. And as long as those things are being unaddressed, you have things like what we just read about here in Cabrini Green happening. As long as police officers are chasing kids or chasing somebody into high rises and then pepper spraying 1-year-olds that somebody's holding, you're going to have that happening. When police officers are raiding Fred Hampton's home and murdering him while he's in his sleep, shooting over 100 shots into his home when only one shot was fired in the exchange. Something that has now been overtly documented was an assassination. When you have those things happening, you can't be surprised that that force is returned with force. And so those are all things that sort of stand out to me about the passages we just read there. And I think that we're about at 30 minutes, if not pretty close to it. So I'm trying to keep it to 30 minutes or under. So we're not going to go over, because if we go over, we're going to end up at about 40 minutes here. So I want to encourage people to continue to listen to the Rockford Reading Daily podcast. If you have not listened to previous episodes of the podcast, please go back and listen to those. If you're listening to this and there's more episodes out, I encourage you to please listen to future episodes. And we will be back tomorrow to continue reading High-Risers by Ben Austin.